volume working? Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, what a lovely morning today. It's an exciting event. It's an important event. We are today launching a landmark report, Africa's Green Energy Revolution, a report that we at Masdar and our platform, the Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week, with the help of our partners, McKinsey, we're launching a very important report around the great potentials of Africa in the spectrum of green energy. An exciting journey that takes us through a lot of potential socio-economic platforms, the vision as we move forward with the great ambitions that the African continent will have in the green hydrogen industry that is, of course, coupled with the renewable energy. Benefits that would exceed expectations, value created, GDP, jobs, clean energy resources, export, the entire spectrum that bring new vision on how green hydrogen in Africa would really shape the economy on the important role that Africa will have moving forward. That being said, I'm going to give the floor to Bernd to take us through this exciting journey with the amazing panelists who are joining us today, and I wish you a very pleasant and fruitful event. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. And it's really exciting to be here with you. So my name is Bernd Heid. I'm a senior partner at McKinsey, and I lead our hydrogen activities globally. In fact, I'm in the hydrogen sector now for over 12 years. So therefore, it's so exciting to be here in the region where all of that is happening, what we more or less forecasted in our report. So therefore, I'm very excited. And Mohammed, thank you for the introduction. This is an important day today, not only for hydrogen, but also for the continent. So let me first start in introducing my esteemed panel for the discussion today. And I would love to start with you, Dr. Faye Al-Hersh. Faye works as a technology specialist in the strategy team of Masdar. So she's responsible for the planning and the development and implementation of Masdar's green hydrogen strategy and also the green hydrogen projects. Next to me on my left side is Karim Hafsi. Karim is the COO of Hassan Alam Holding, and he leads operation at the infrastructure investment and development arm of Hassan Alam. And he also has held various board positions at several petrochemical and solar energy companies, including Calm Solar and Carbon Holdings. To his left, we have Manuel Kühn. Manuel is Vice President of Sustainable Energy Systems at Siemens Energy. He worked for over 18 years now in various positions in Siemens and is now heading the global sales team for Siemens' new energy business. So he is responsible for delivering the hydrogen and also the Power-to-X solutions projects. Then we have on the far right from your side, Wale Shonibare. He's a responsible director for energy financial solutions, as well as policy and regulations of the African Development Bank. So Wale helped to establish the African Development Bank Financial Solutions team. This is a leading transaction team across the whole continent. So he supported the launch of flagship initiatives to enable private sector investments in the energy sector. So we will have a great conversation, and I'm already looking forward to that. So before we start, let me level set the discussion and share a few facts about the continent and the potential of Africa in this energy revolution as we have seen it. So as we speak right now, you see on this world map the global distribution of hydrogen projects. And we took the major projects. And as we speak right now, this is the latest release, we have 680 mega projects around the globe. And you see that many of them focus on the deployment on hydrogen in various industries, from steel, petrochemical, ammonia production, and others. But you also have at-scale production projects. And you see the North African Rim, South Africa, and also Middle East is a prime region where we will see the deployment of giga-scale hydrogen production and also its derivatives. So when we look at the investment sum that this project pipeline resembles, we speak of 240 billion of investments that flow into that sector until the end of the decade. Half of that has reached a FEED stage. A fraction of it is already at FID stage. And if you just compare the trajectory, 6 months ago, this number was only 50% less than it is now. So we see an acceleration of the momentum and also the deployment. So this is a chart that I get excited about, and you cannot read everything on the bottom. But what the chart tells you, it's basically these 660 million tons of hydrogen that we see until the end of or mid of the century, that resembles 22% of the global energy demand. And we stacked each country on this planet where hydrogen could play a role according to its cost. So the left means cheapest hydrogen, the right means most expensive hydrogen. And that also explains one of the reasons we always hear hydrogen is important for these hard-to-abate sectors. But hydrogen also plays a role in the coupling of energy systems. We will not be able to export Egyptian or Middle Eastern sun into Europe or other places on this planet in absence of this molecule. So the molecule acts as an energy vector to be able to couple energy systems of the future. So when you look at the total cost curve as we see it, you will find that 70% of the hydrogen that will be traded in the future come out of 10 major countries and regions, and this region belongs to it. And on the other hand, we have a very concentrated demand market. Think of Europe. Europe will be short in renewable energy, so we will be importing energy into Europe. Asia is the same with Korea and Japan. And that more or less explains why do we have this international trade being developed. Let's have a look at and the slide sorter doesn't want. Stephanie will help me. So I will continue while we are trying to get the next page, but I see also we have problems here. So on this world map, you see the future trade flows. Global energy demand 2050 is 660 million tons. 400 out of these 660 are being traded, and 200 cross borders of countries. So what you see here, and that is not like a rough imagination, this is like we modeled all of these countries that you have seen, all of the offtake in a model, and that gives us 1.5 million permutations. But what you see nicely on this chart is that the North African Rim is a prime exporter into Europe. As I said earlier, Europe will be short in energy, so therefore the majority of the energy that we will receive in the future will be from North Africa and also Middle East. But you also see this is a topic for the whole continent. It's not only North Africa. We see also great potential in South Africa, which the export happens more in the form of liquids. But nonetheless, this is a great opportunity for Africa as a continent. So let me close before we start the discussion on a short projection, and that is also facts from the report that we today launch. You see on the right side 102 million tons. That is what Europe will need as hydrogen demand in the future. And we more or less depicted what is the most cost-efficient way to get that hydrogen to Europe. There's some fraction of it that is core Europe. So of course we can produce offshore wind-based hydrogen, but it will be expensive. Nonetheless, that will happen. And we also will see hydrogen coming from Iberia. But what you see in that chart very clearly is that the most important import source for hydrogen into Europe, and when I say hydrogen, I mean hydrogen in a gaseous form, in a liquid form, think of ammonia, think of e-methanol, think of synthetic fuel, and even think of DRI pellets for the steel industry. All of that is subsumed under the demand that goes into continental Europe, and that's with the 27 million tons, the majority and the bulk of what we will see in the future in Europe. So with that, let me turn to our panelists and go through a couple of the facts of the reports. So we have seen that this is a great opportunity not only globally but also for the continent. Out of these projects that I mentioned, we see already 20 and more mega-scale projects in Africa. And with the announcement that you made together, we see a 4 gigawatt scale pipeline here. And maybe let me start, Wale, with you. Here in the continent, what do you see as the opportunities for hydrogen for Africa?
Thank you very much, Bernd. I hope everyone can hear me. I think hydrogen presents an excellent opportunity for Africa to become an energy superpower. And the reason I'm saying that is given the natural resources, the irradiation levels, the wind, energy potential in places like in North Africa and also Namibia. And also you mustn't forget the hydro potential. So countries like Ethiopia have significant hydro potential and geothermal as well. So these are all areas where you have cheap energy and you can produce green hydrogen. The problem has always been finding the investment and finding anchor offtake to allow these projects to happen. And for me, the excitement is about the potential this offers to allow Africa to industrialize and to serve Africa's own domestic needs, because you can anchor these projects on to produce the investments required for electrification of national economies and also development of sub-industries around these hydrogen clusters. So that's the potential I see for Africa. And what we've always had in the development of utilities in Africa is you have people paying in local currency and you're raising financing in hard currency. There's obviously a mismatch there, but with this hydrogen potential, you can generate revenues in hard currency, and also that allows you to actually build the infrastructure, and then as a ancillary benefit, you can electrify your local economies. So for us, we're very supportive and very excited about the potential.
Thank you, Wale. Manuel, let me turn it to you. So we heard there's a great potential. A lot of projects are being in the planning. But still, it takes a village to get these projects off the ground. What are your views to get these projects really to the finish line? When we say FID, that's the main decision point in a project of multiple players. What's your perspective? How can we accelerate that?
Now, the first topic is offtake. You have shown it beautifully, Bernd, that by the logic of what's going on globally, there is no doubt about that the off-taker is there in the bigger picture. But then if you go into the small picture and ask in the specific project, how do I start and how do I make ends meet on that particular project or even on that particular project phase, then the trouble starts. So I'm not so much worried about the picture and what happens in 20 years or in 30 years. I think there we are all more or less aligned. The question is what happens in 3 years, 5 years, and 8 years from now. And here we have to start looking a bit at the details on how to set up the projects right. So offtake is one topic. Now the offtaker has a certain price point. We cannot burden the offtakers too much with that. So we have to work on the question, what is a fair price point that allows the offtakers to adapt to the green fuels, whatever that might be, but also that gives the industry enough room to breathe and to keep investing in technology and capacity ramp up in order to drive the cost down. So that of course, there is an inherent conflict into this, and we need to find good compromises that allow everybody who is involved, from our sub-suppliers up to the common people that need gas for cooking. We need to make sure that everybody shares the risk evenly, and then we can get it done.
Thank you. Faye, over to you. Speaking of risk-taking, you at Masdar took the risk, and you made a bold decision on investing into Egypt, into the continent, with a 4 gigawatt hydrogen project, or it's basically two times 2 gigawatt. Faye, how do you see the opportunity, and why Africa? Why do you decide to invest here into Egypt?
Well, there's no denying that there is a global momentum to decarbonize as part of this energy transition towards net zero, where specifically green hydrogen and green hydrogen derivatives would represent one of the very few options for certain sectors to achieve efficient decarbonization. And of course, the African continent specifically is well positioned to produce this green hydrogen cost competitively and become basically a green hydrogen hub that would serve both the domestic demand, but as well as the export market, as we've seen earlier. And of course, this is attributed to the excellent renewable energy resources, specifically in the northern region, northern western region, southern region, specifically for solar and wind, the abundance of land which would be required to deploy these large gigawatt scales of renewable plus green hydrogen projects. And of course, it's ideally located between key trading routes. So of course, in our report, we've shown that 30 to 60 million tons per annum of green hydrogen could be produced in the African continent by 2050 at a cost of $1.2 to $1.6 per kilogram. And of course, this would require significant investments, but the benefits for the African continent are also expected to be significant. So up to 3.7 million jobs would be created as part of this, leading to a GDP impact of $120 billion US dollars. Of course, there are other benefits, such as the general increase of the clean energy ecosystem and the electrification of rural communities and so on. Of course, we at Masdar, we've recognized the potential in the African continent, and we've, as you mentioned, we've made an announcement to develop a green hydrogen project with a capacity of 4 gigawatts, together with our partners, of course, by 2030. And this would be in 2 key locations here in Egypt, so the Suez Canal Economic Zone, as well as at the Mediterranean coast. So we plan to be at the forefront of Africa's transition towards green hydrogen and the development of the green hydrogen sector here. And although the majority, let's say, of the projects that have been announced so far have been focused on the northern part, let's say, of Africa, as part of the report, we've shown that other regions within the African continent would be key in the development of the sector here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Karim, you're one of, or your company is one of the co-developers of this project, and at Hassan Alam, you basically close gaps in the service and the energy supply infrastructure. So how do you see the role of hydrogen in the development of infrastructure, not only in Egypt, but also in the Middle Eastern and broader African region?
Okay. Basically, I heard a fact from the president of your bank the other day, Mr. Adesina. He was saying that, Africa has 60% of the potential global supply of renewables, but in actual fact, it only has 1% installed capacity, which for me is a crazy statistic, given how much potential there is and how much lack of development has been so far. Hydrogen can be the enabler for not only increased renewable resources or development in Africa, but also these projects require significant infrastructure, whether it's roads, ports, pipelines, renewable energy production, which will basically help improve the livelihood of the communities in Africa. You can develop a skilled workforce that will need to work on these development of these projects and all the contracting work that is required for these projects. So I think hydrogen could be an enabler um, for a lot of this infrastructure that needs to be built for these projects to succeed.
That's interesting. And what I like is it's hydrogen is one vector, but also we have to see hydrogen comes together with the renewables, and we need to speak also about the electron that stands behind the molecule in the generation. So when we look at the symbiosis between the two, it's basically number one, hydrogen is for the solar industry a great off-taker. It's a major anchor off-taker. It helps in the grid balancing and grid stabilization. And thirdly, it also helps to enable an overarching renewable ecosystem. Yeah. So Faye, you do both. Describe us with your words on the symbiosis or the coexistence of hydrogen projects and solar development in parallel.
I would say it's precisely as you mentioned it right now. Of course, ultimately, the deployment of green hydrogen projects would help the expansion and acceleration of the distribution of renewable energy in the African continent. Again, stabilizing the African grid and developing the infrastructure. And this is achieved through a number of ways, and I can elaborate more on that. So the first way is, as you rightfully mentioned, the green hydrogen would serve as an anchor offtake. That would allow the addition of renewables into the system. So, and for example, basically, there's also a potential to, let's say, oversize your renewable energy plant to help serve additional electrification demand, in addition, of course, to the green hydrogen that will be produced. And the second way is basically for the models where you'd have the project connected to the grid. The green hydrogen plants would serve as a grid buffer. That would help the faster integration of renewables into the system. And this is, of course, attributed to the flexibility of the loading of the electrolyzers. So, for example, they could operate at partial loading or full loading, depending on the demand profile, of course. And then ultimately, of course, the distribution or the addition of these green hydrogen projects would create that robust renewable energy ecosystem. That would help the faster deployment of the renewable energy projects. Because it can help, let's say, co-subsidize the development of the infrastructure that would be required. And this, we anticipate to observe these benefits across the various, let's say, green hydrogen project models or archetypes, but more specifically for the large or the gigawatt scale green hydrogen projects that would be grid connected and mainly serving the export market.
Thank you. You speak about ecosystems, and I heard that phrase from a couple of you. Maybe, Vale, for you is, can hydrogen unlock these ecosystems, and what does that mean for clean tech deployment here in Africa on the continent?
Yeah, thanks, Bernd. Recently, we convened the first meeting of the Africa Green Hydrogen Alliance. And that's 6 countries initially: Egypt, Morocco, Mauritania, Kenya, Namibia, South Africa. And since that time, other countries have come forward to say that they want to join. So countries like Cameroon with significant hydro resources, as well as Ethiopia. So what we're saying is we're convening African countries. It's very important. Within the African Development Bank, we have the African Legal Support Facility. And what that does is to help African countries negotiate with foreign investors coming into the country, because we've seen many mistakes in the past. We want there to be a level playing field. So there's an ecosystem of institutions that we need to get together to make sure that Africa is properly represented. So this is not just an initiative to serve European markets. It has to serve Africa. The number one priority for Africa is energy access. There's 600 million Africans without electricity. So whatever we're doing, we have to build in Africa's interest. So one thing you cannot say to governments in Africa is, we're developing these green hydrogen resources just to export to Europe. There has to be a very strong local content, as well as the benefits for African economies. And the story has to be put in that perspective. And you have to be aware of the role of civil society and local populations in in order to carry everybody along, because we've seen large developments in places like Mozambique LNG, 23 billion, which is higher than GDP of the entire country. That project is stalled right now because of local disturbances. So it's very important in this conversation that we have to make sure that those voices are heard as we make these investments. So the ecosystem needs to include local partners, local communities, local industries, and we have to work out how to develop the grids and distribution system, the entire value chain of electricity in African countries, as well as the green hydrogen potential for export.
I think that's a perfect segue. You speak about benefits for Africa, so we are not want just to convert African sun into electrons, into molecules and export it. What's in it for the continent, yeah? And Manuel, your company is committed to this continent, and you are one of the leading tech players that produce these machines that can convert basically energy and water into hydrogen. What's your view? Is that something that can be localized, or does it at all create jobs in the continent?
I think the question that we often get, and what we're also debating here, is can we do it this time different than with any other resource that was exploited in Africa? And the key answer is if we want to have a different result, then we also have a different approach this time. And the key will be to enable local communities. What we cannot forget is that some of the, similar to the LNG example, some of the structures that need to be built right now to export large-scale hydrogen in whatever shape or form into Europe, we are talking about magnitudes of larger energy systems than what the actual country has today. So the incremental additional effort to make it just for the community, that's marginal on the project. This is not going to be the problem. It just requires us to think about and make it a part of the plan. Where I am a bit more worried, and I come to localization, the third point, where I'm a bit more worried about is the fundamentals of doing business. The electrolyzer plants, the whole infrastructure they need, it's very capital intensive. Africa, by default, is a place where you have relatively high capital cost. So this does not go along. Is this now a reason not to do it? No. Is this a reason to wonder in which order globally the attention will go? That is something we need to think about. So the capital and the attention of the technology, it will go to the projects that are easy to implement. And because we don't have infrastructures already available, because we have higher financing costs, because implementation is a bit more complicated in Africa, these are all reasons to maybe deprioritize. So what we need to debate is how we make sure that a fair share of the attention goes today into African projects and is not consumed by other regions that make it easier. I mean, what the US have done with the Inflation Reduction Act is fantastic because it creates competition between the different regions for attention, for money, but it also creates competition between the different regions. So we have to think about how we manage that. Now, last point on localization. The simple answer is yes, because everything that is done in Africa, it has to be big because it will be purpose-built. It's not incremental improvements of an existing refinery or something. So the typical project we have in Europe, for example, is always an add-on to something that already exists. That is relatively small money. It's typically funded today. The average project in Africa is a completely different animal, and by default, it's so large that you need to think about how to bring the supply chain closer to the installation. Otherwise, from a pure logistical standpoint, it would not make sense.
Thank you. But that's very encouraging. So let me look in the report and also cite some of the benefits that are here for the continent. So number one is hydrogen industry could produce, Faye mentioned earlier, between 30 to 60 million tons, each year. Second, it could create between 1.9 and 3.7 million jobs for the continent. Thirdly, if we look at the GDP impact, and Vale spoke about that, we quantified something between 60 to 120 billion of GDP impact by 2050 for the continent. That's massive. And lastly, we also spoke what's in it for the continent. It helps on the broader economic development, but also it helps on the electrification of the continent with all the side benefits. Karim, over to you. You have a track record with your companies of developing large-scale energy and infrastructure projects. How do you quantify or see these benefits of these projects?
No, I think these benefits, the benefits of these projects are very big to the country, the continent, and the community we live in. It brings access to a big suite of investment, usually foreign investment coming into the country, which and therefore you help develop downstream sectors and the service sector, providing support to these projects which didn't exist before. My worry or my concern about all of these things we're talking about is what do we need to do in order to realize these projects, right? We're talking about all the great potential that can happen to the continent if this happens, but at the moment, at the stage we're in today, we still need more clarity on regulation. I think the report quotes that less than 1% of projects announced have reached FID. And I think that's a very, very low number of projects. And the reason is regulation. There needs to be more clarity. The developers cannot finalize the configuration of their projects or get financing unless there's clarity. There needs to be alignment between the different governments talking about certification, what is considered green. There needs to be some tradability aspect to this commodity. And if one region has different certification requirements than the other, that makes it more difficult. And finally, I think also, you mentioned the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that makes the US super competitive. So people looking to, international companies looking to invest in these projects, by default will favor, the US over Africa. The African, I guess, the continent, maybe does not have the resources the US have to provide these kinds of incentives, but who can? And maybe this is a discussion which we need to have with Europe, which needs about 10 million tons of additional ammonia by 2030, and they need to encourage developers to be able to build projects so that they can get this energy they need.
Thank you. So I think we are all in agreement that there is a great opportunity. And the numbers clearly articulate that. Vale, you have experience in what could trigger unlocks, or how could we basically make sure that this is also unlocked and not stuck? So what's your perspective from other projects? What could trigger this positive economic and social development here in Africa?
Well, one of the key things that we do as the African Development Bank is to facilitate investments into Africa, both from local and international investors. And we shouldn't forget the role of local capital. One of the largest refinery projects in the world in Nigeria is being financed by a local investor, $19 billion. So that's the scale of a hydrogen project. And there are local investors in Egypt and South Africa and other places. The fact of the matter is, there's no continent or country that's ever been developed by foreign capital. We welcome the foreign capital, but most of the capital that will develop Africa will come out of Africa. And what we have to do is to put in place mechanisms to mobilize local savings and local capital markets, and the African Development Bank plays a very central role in facilitating these flows of investments. And we have sovereign wealth funds in Africa as well, who are investing massively across the continent. I think projects will happen. Obviously, there are countries that are more difficult than others, but so we have that everywhere. So where there's low-hanging fruit, Namibia has amazing resources for green hydrogen, as well as the solar and the irradiation and the proximity to the sea. And so the investments will speak for themselves, and the markets are there. And in some countries that are relatively more industrialized, you have the opportunity for for green steel, for methanol, and green ammonia. So there is a domestic, by 2040, the African population is going to double. You know, so you're going to have a 2 billion population. With the AFCFTA, that's the Africa Free Trade Agreement, you're going to have the largest free trade zone in the world. So there's a market there, and that's the youngest population as well. So the average population is about 18 years. So as Europe ages and Asia ages, the largest markets, the consumers of the world are going to be in Africa. So then it becomes a no-brainer to come and invest and to set up the value chains to allow that to happen. Thank you.
So to unlock that investment, let me follow up on that one. So there are different unlocks that you also describe in the report. So number one, of course, they're integrated energy and hydrogen roadmaps per country and also for the continent. That's important. We need regulation, and it's also the stability, and think of everything that goes with codes and standards. Certification is an important topic. So we need these frameworks in place. We need infrastructure, because that spans multiple countries, connects Africa to Europe. And we also need to have new capabilities and new skills. And is that an opportunity to also reskilling people? So in all of these unlocks, Karim, let me start with you. What do you see as the critical enablers to unlock that development of both renewables and also hydrogen across, this is a matter across private and also public sector and also the investment side?
I mean, we just spoke about regulation, and I think this is the key at this stage, because there is no clarity yet, and it is a moving target. And until this is better established and better defined and stable, people will have difficulty reaching FID and unlocking these projects. The other point also is in Egypt, for example, the grid is a public grid. The amount of money the government would need to develop and to upgrade the grid to be able to evacuate all of this additional renewable resources, wind and solar, for hydrogen and eventually for exporting this hydrogen and whatever, is huge sums of money. The government will need funding and financing from international development institutions and the like to be able to make these upgrades, and so that these private sector projects can happen. And this is a critical enabler as we speak today, because without this, the projects cannot take off. And finally, the financing. Africa is, let's say, higher risk investment, I guess, than more developed markets in Europe and the US or in the West. We need access to competitive financing, financing that acknowledges the infancy stage that this market is in and is willing basically to, put their money where their mouth is, as they've been all speaking in this conference, and work alongside the developers and the governments to make these projects happen.
Thank you. And maybe we're coming close to time, so therefore I would love to turn to you, Faye. What's your view on the unlocks and how can we accelerate the momentum?
So yes, as part of the report, we mentioned 6 clear enablers, but of course I'd just like to elaborate on just a few, given the time constraint as well. So you mentioned previously that it's important to establish a integrated, comprehensive renewables plus hydrogen roadmap. So not just a hydrogen roadmap, but a renewable plus hydrogen roadmap. And this should take into account, of course, the total demand required, the access and affordability to the residents and the energy exporters, and then basically use all these elements to build this vision on how much renewables is required and how much hydrogen is required. Of course, it should take into account the current grid capacity and where would it make sense to focus on as future bottlenecks to expand on. Ideally, it should include a geographical plan on where it would make sense to locate these large renewable plus hydrogen projects, and where would it make sense to oversize the renewable energy capacity. Maybe as well, just to add to the points that Wale mentioned about creating and building the sourcing, first of all, and building within the continent the necessary skill force. this is very crucial, specifically to develop these large gigawatt scale projects, which are expected to be in regions where there is no infrastructure. So basically sourcing and then building these capabilities that would require an integrated development of the renewable part, of the hydrogen production part, of the hydrogen conversion part, and then if there's an export element associated to it as well, so the infrastructure that would be required for that. So that requires an integrated EPC capabilities. So it would be very critical to build those local capabilities within the African continent for the success of the green hydrogen sector within Africa.
So thank you very much. I think we could continue for at least another hour in the conversation. I thank you for your time and also thank my audience. If I leave this place and also want to share some reflections. So number one, what I learned in today's conversation is, first of all, hydrogen is real. It came to the center stage and is no longer a side topic. And I think also hydrogen in the specific context of Africa and also for the region here has a huge potential. It is coupling future energy systems and the continent is gifted with renewable energy. So basically we are at the brink of a new global energy system and this continent is energy rich. So that's good news for all of us, and we will see that what I learned from the conversation, it's not only about the potential of how can Africa participate in the export of energy into the developed world like your neighbors in Europe, but also on like what can it do for the continent in providing electricity and providing infrastructure here on the continent. And we spoke a lot about there's still a long journey and there are a lot of unlocks to tackle on that journey, but I leave inspired, having met fearless and courageous leaders here who don't only talk about the unlocks that are necessary, but basically you make it happen. And congratulations to the announcements of the 4 gigawatt. I think today is an excellent day and an important milestone in this global energy transition and also for the continent. So thank you very much for your time and your perspectives, and also thank you in the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.